Hey everyone, Ryan here from IKN. So in this video, we're going to go through a very brief but simple biomechanical model to guide how you assess and treat overhead limitations. Okay, specifically discussing here when it's necessary to introduce strategies that facilitate thoracic extension. And the reason we feel this is important is because very often the knee-jerk reaction when healthcare professionals have a client where there's a lot of overhead limitation or shoulder elevation limitations, the knee-jerk reaction is to get them on a foam roller and begin to extend the thoracic spine. Okay, but as you learn in this video, we need to sequence when it's important to facilitate thoracic extension. Sometimes it's important early on, sometimes it's important later on during the rehab process, depending on what plane of motion the shoulder is limited in. And the reason that is because when you look at research surrounding overhead limitations or shoulder elevation limitations, typically those limitations are described within three different planes. So we have shoulder flexion or humeral flexion, which occurs in the sagittal plane. We have scaption, which occurs in the scapular plane, kind of midway between shoulder flexion and abduction. And then we have abduction, which occurs in the frontal plane, okay? Now, within these three different planes, which are kind of broadly described as shoulder elevation, there's a different interaction that occurs between the thoracic spine ribcage, scapula, and humerus. So we need to talk about when it's important to facilitate a different behavior at the scapula, a different behavior at the thoracic spine, and a different behavior at the humerus. So firstly, we need to discuss thoracic spine and scapular interactions. Okay. Now, with your arms relaxed by your sides, if you were to flex your thoracic spine, you're naturally going to feel your scapulae begin to protract and internally rotate, and that's naturally going to drag the humerus into more internal rotation. Okay, so thoracic flexion will naturally drag the scapulae into protraction and internal rotation, and then the opposite is true of thoracic extension. So if you relax your arms by your side and you extend your thoracic spine, you're naturally going to feel your scapulae begin to retract and externally rotate, where the glenoid cavity faces more laterally. So during flexion of the thoracic spine, when the scapulae protract, the glenoid cavity, the socket of the scapula, will point more into the sagittal plane, okay? So we can think of it within the context of those three different planes of motion. During shoulder flexion, the scapula will have to protract and internally rotate more to bring the humerus into the sagittal plane. When we move into the scapular plane, because the glenoid cavity doesn't have to point into the sagittal plane as much, scapular protraction is not as important. And then when we look into the frontal plane towards abduction, the protraction and internal rotation of the scapula isn't really necessary at all, okay? This is important when we consider when is it necessary to express thoracic extension, because during the early phases of shoulder flexion in the sagittal plane, the scapula will need to protract and internally rotate, meaning we need a little bit more thoracic flexion. It doesn't mean we need to flex the thoracic spine a lot, but we need the thoracic spine to bias a little bit more flexion. And then as we move through the later ranges of humeral flexion or shoulder flexion, that's when the thoracic spine will need to extend to allow the scapula to externally rotate and posteriorly tilt to reach end range shoulder flexion, okay? But if we look at that within the context of humeral abduction, if, for example, you try this now, if you flex your thoracic spine and maintain that flexion and allow that scapula on your left-hand side, let's say, to protract and internally rotate, and now try and bring your humerus into the frontal plane through abduction, okay? And you're going to find that you can't get very far. In order to get further through humeral abduction in the frontal plane, you'll need to extend your thoracic spine and externally rotate your scapula to bring the humerus further through humeral abduction, okay? So when we have clients that have limitations in shoulder flexion, we need to first understand, do they have the capacity to flex the thoracic spine, protract the scapula, and then towards the end range of shoulder flexion, that's when they need more thoracic extension, okay? So we need to consider, do they have the capacity to flex the thoracic spine before they have the capacity to extend the thoracic spine? But if we have an individual with no limitations in shoulder flexion, but with limitations in shoulder abduction, that's when we need to consider their capacity to extend the thoracic spine early on and to be able to externally rotate the scapula. Okay, so two different scenarios there by considering the overhead elevation or shoulder elevation in different planes in flexion versus abduction during shoulder flexion in the sagittal plane, we need the thoracic spine to flex early on, and that will allow the scapula to be able to protract and internal rotate. And then in the end range, or the second half of shoulder flexion, that's when we need the thoracic spine to extend, the scapula to be able to externally rotate. But again, when we look at that within the context of shoulder abduction, that's when we don't really need the thoracic spine to be able to flex early on. We need the thoracic spine to be able to begin in more extension, to facilitate that external rotation of the scapula, so that we can bring that humerus through the frontal plane and through the full range of humeral abduction.